Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Hall, and welcome to Asian American Literature. So, we are going to start off the term with this collection of short stories, Interpretive Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. To start, there are a number of reasons that I chose this book, and the first thing is that just for practical purposes, I didn't want you guys having to jump into a full novel our first couple of weeks. So what I decided to do was just give you one short story for the first week, just something to kind of get us talking, and then you'll have two more for the second week. And then after that, then we'll get into our first book. I'm also providing the stories for you as well. So if you're waiting on your books to come in or your money for the bookstore, whatever the case may be, you have a little bit of time. Not a lot, but a tiny bit. So the second reason is that when we talk about Asian Americans, I think that a lot of people kind of clump that group all together, and really it's quite a diverse group. And when we talk about Asia itself, we're looking at not just China and Japan, but we'll also this term be looking at authors who have a heritage based in Korea, Singapore, Cambodia, and then this book, which is from an Indian American author. So I think that hopefully you can get the richness of diversity of not just the Asian cultures, but also the particular experiences of those who have come to the United States as well, and who maybe live here as second generation or third generation, and all of that kind of thing. So for each book, I think for each book, we're going to talk a little bit about history, and then we're also going to talk about some of the fictional elements. You can see some listed over here. We're going to look at, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of an overview for narration, symbolism, themes, that kind of thing. And we'll also be looking at the things in the books that are universal experiences that really anybody can experience and relate to, and then the things in the book that are really unique to the author's culture and the culture that they're writing about. So I think that it'll be a really interesting class, and I'm very excited, and I hope that you enjoy these short stories. So before I get into the first one that you're going to have for week one, which is called When Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine, that book features some historical elements that I just kind of, or that story, sorry. The short story features some historical elements that I want to kind of go over and discuss. So I'm going to shrink this, and then we'll look at some pictures. Okay, so I want to start here. The story that you're going to be reading takes place in the 1970s, but the history of what's actually going on in the background of the story goes back a lot further. So throughout the 1800s and into the Second World War, the British had colonized India and a number of other countries, but for their purposes, they called it British India. And they had appointed rulers of the British Raj, and I'm going to show you guys some pictures of what that looked like. But I just want you to see here how much of the area was controlled by the British during that colonial period. This is a picture depicting the 1700s painting, and you can kind of see the way that people were kind of treated by the British as second class, and the way that they had servants and things like that. And this is, I think, 1910, around there somewhere. So this went on for quite some period of time. And what basically ended up happening is that after World War II, a number of countries removed themselves from the other countries that they had been colonizing. So we have what's called the partition of India in 1947. Eventually, you can see some of the area that they controlled is not in this, because now we're just talking about India itself as opposed to a few of the other countries. But what ended up happening is that when the British left, there were a number of tensions between areas of the country that were primarily Hindu and areas of the country that were primarily Muslim. And so they decided to partition or cut in sections the country. And this section became Pakistan. This section became East Pakistan. And then this section is known as India. There's also Sri Lanka and a few other, as I said, Burma and a few other places that kind of had a little bit of separate history. But essentially, what ended up happening is that this partition was supposed to take place in 1948. Because the tensions were rising between the various religious groups, they had to move the date up. And when that occurred, a lot of people were displaced. There were a number of refugees because people were trying to travel to those sections that they now wanted to live in. And I have got some pictures here of what that looked like. So here are people getting onto a train and trying to, you can see how many people are trying to move before this partition takes place. This is I'll make this a little bit bigger for you guys here, and I'll bring it to the front. Oops. Can I bring it to the front? There we go. This is one of the refugee camps. So you can kind of see it's like a tent city almost set up. And I like this picture because it shows the emotion of these two boys who are like, what has happened and what's going on. A number of people died during this period from this migration. So about 10 to 20 million people were displaced, and the estimates are rough, especially because of the dates that we're looking at, but they estimate that about 250 to possibly 1 million people died. Some of that was from the sectarian violence between the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Muslims, and then part of it is kind of almost a mutual genocide, but part of it was just from this moving. And the migration that took place. So what ends up happening, and here you can see a few more pictures of this migration, people packing up kind of everything they own and moving. But what ends up happening basically is that the tensions didn't completely cease, and you had, as I showed you in the other picture, East Pakistan as well as Pakistan. And they're split in the middle by the country that's now known as India. So in 1971, there's a war, and what has been called the Forgotten Genocide happens in East Pakistan as tensions kind of spill over. And that is what's taking place during our story. So just to kind of give you the background, there are a group of people here who are fighting for Bangladesh independence, and they have this basically revolution and an armed conflict that comes up in this area as they're trying to break from the rest of Pakistan. And they are eventually successful, but the man in the story is living in the United States, and he has family back in that particular area. The narrator lives in, she lives in the United States, but her family was originally from India. And so there are some religious differences between the two families, but they are very friendly terms as they're here in the United States. But that's basically what's going on. And here are some pictures. Again, people displaced, many people killed by their own government. And it was one of the in terms of percentage of the population, you can see, I don't want to linger on this too long for you guys, but people starving and that kind of thing. At the same time, in this story, Mr. Pirzada came to Dine. It's 1971 in the United States, and it's Halloween time. So we have here, I picked up some pictures of kids in 1971 at Halloween. And this is a picture of people in Boston where the story takes place. There were many people from that area. So from Bangladesh, from India, from Pakistan, who came into the Boston area. And the story does take place in Boston, as does one of the other stories I'm having you guys read. So Jhumpa Lahiri is a woman who was born in London but raised in the United States. Her parents are from the West Bengal region of India, and she considers herself an American. She grew up in Rhode Island, and eventually she went to Boston University and Barnard College. And so this picture, I think, is kind of representative of the type of childhood that she probably had growing up in that particular time period. She was born in 1967, so she's about the same age as the girl in our story. And you can kind of, I hope, get from these pictures the vast difference between what is happening here and what is happening overseas, right? The difficulties and the strife and the turmoil that's going on there, as opposed to life in Boston in the 1970s, where it is during Halloween time, but here they're having ice creams from the ice cream truck and that kind of thing. So that's just a little bit of, that's just a little bit of background for you guys, that you kind of have a good understanding of the world events going on at the time our story takes place, because the setting for this first story is quite important. So it is called When Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine, and just to give you a brief overview without any spoilers, Mr. Pirzada is the friend of the family that the narrator is from. So we have Lilia, a 10-year-old girl, her father, her mother, and then their friend, Mr. Pirzada. Lilia and her family are Indian by descent. Mr. Pirzada is technically from East Pakistan at this point. So the story basically is a number of different nights when Mr. Pirzada is coming over for dinner, and we have some discussion of what's going on in this war, and he's worried for his wife and his many daughters. And at the same time, Lilia is going to school. She's trying to kind of find out more about India and her cultural heritage, but that's not really taught in American schools, especially at that point in time. And so there's this tension between what the grown-ups are telling her, what she doesn't know, what she's not really able to find out. And then also, it's interesting because if they were back in that region of the country, they might not be friends, but because they have a lot of shared culture and shared traditions, they're quite friendly in the United States. So we see them around Halloween time, and we see them going trick-or-treating and that kind of thing. And then we find out eventually what happens to Mr. Pirzada and his family. So the narration and the point of view here, it is told from Lilia's point of view. So she is a 10-year-old child, and because of that, again, a lot of the things going on, she's kind of naive and unaware of. And so I'd like you to kind of look for that as you read the narration. What are things that she knows and understands, and what are things that are kind of hidden from her because of her age? Candy plays a big role in this story. And I put this in your study guide for you as well. But Mr. Pirzada brings candy for Lilia every time he comes over, and she treasures these, and she begins to use candy in this kind of very childlike ritual where she's saying a prayer for Mr. Pirzada and his family, and then eating a piece of candy. And that's very, again, kind of connected to the narration because it's a very common thing for children to do, that kids have these rituals and kind of superstitions that if I do such and such a thing at a certain time of day, that might mean something. And also candy means something to kids, right? It's like something that they desire. It's almost a form of currency in some ways. And Halloween here kind of represents these American customs that Lilia, as a 10-year-old who has grown up in Boston, she's been doing this every year. And this is the first year she's allowed to go just with her friend out on their own. But because of that, we have this theme of disconnection, that she's really, in many ways, although her parents might talk about India, they might make Indian food for her, she's disconnected from Indian history and many of the traditions and customs. So having Mr. Pirzada there brings out some of the history and even the current events that she has kind of been disconnected from and unaware of. So that's something that I would like you to kind of look at for this week. For next week, we're going to be looking at the first story in the collection, A Temporary Matter, and then also Interpreter of Maladies. So I'll go through those kind of briefly as well. A Temporary Matter is the story of two people, again living in Boston, who are immigrants from India, and they are married, and they're having some marital strife and difficulties, and the power goes out, and they're left without electricity for a number of days. And what basically ends up happening is that they start playing what they're calling a game. And it seems like maybe they're healing their marriage, maybe they're coming back together, but they start telling each other secrets of things that they've been worried about and keeping from one another. And so as the story progresses, we get to see the relationship between them and what's happening as they're revealing these secrets. So the narration is from the third person, so it's not a character in the story telling the story the way it was with Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine. And it follows Shobha and Shukumar as they navigate their marriage. Every time we talk about narration, there's kind of a continuum between omniscient, where the narrator knows everything, and limited, where the narrator really is just focused on their point of view. Whenever you have a first-person narrator, like we have in Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine, it's going to be a little bit more limited, especially since it's from a child's point of view, because they have a little bit limited understanding, right? Here, it's not completely omniscient in that there are some things that the narrator doesn't tell us. So it's a little bit limited in terms of having some secrets that are withheld until the end. We as the reader or the audience, we don't know all the secrets right off the bat. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting way to write the story, so that we kind of know what the husband and wife know about each other as they're revealing it to each other. The symbolism in the story, the darkness is something that usually separates people, but here it's kind of bringing them together. And then there's also some talk of a baby, and I don't want to get into that yet, but I do want you to kind of consider how that might be a metaphor for the relationship between Shobha and Shukumar. The themes here, though, I have this idea of disconnection in all three of these stories. And in this particular story, we don't exactly see the disconnection between people and their culture. We see the disconnection between the two people themselves and the disconnection that's in their marriage and the marital strife that's kind of come out of that. So it's not exactly the same disconnection, but I think that this idea of being not fully, I don't know how else to put that, not fully connected, or being kind of alienated, having that sense of displacement. So even though that's not the central message of the story, doesn't have to do so much with the Indian culture, and it is a lot more, I think, some universal themes here about marriage and love and trauma and secrets and that kind of thing. I do want you to consider how the theme of disconnection and alienation and isolation, how that has continued in this story the way that it was in the first story that you read for the first week. So, interpreter of maladies. Okay, in this story, we have an interpreter who is from India, and his name is Mr. Kapasi. He is an Indian interpreter who takes tourists around to various sites in India. So we have Mr. and Mrs. Das and their children. And what ends up basically happening is that we just see this family who's been living in America. Their children were born in America. They're Indian by descent. And we see them trying to take in the culture of their home country. And again, this idea of disconnection, alienation, that kind of thing, isolation, they're not fully connecting with what's going on. And they seem to, in some ways, kind of be going through the motions. Mrs. Das, in particular, is very disconnected from her family, and seems to almost kind of not want to be there. So Mr. Kapasi, as a man who is from India and still lives there, is kind of taking all of this in and observing the family. He kind of becomes almost enamored by Mrs. Das, and he feels like they have maybe some kind of a connection. And the narration and the point of view here is interesting. I think it could have been told from the point of view of Mr. Kapasi, but it isn't. It is told again in third person. And we have, again, some secrets that are being told. So a little bit of limitation for the narration as it follows more Mr. Kapasi and what he's thinking, rather than showing you also what Mrs. Das is thinking, what Mr. Das is thinking, what their children are thinking. So consider why the author chooses to kind of limit the narration almost to Mr. Kapasi's point of view, and why the American family here isn't so much the focus of the story as their interpreter is. The themes here, again, the disconnect between American culture and the culture of India, the idea of, they talk about, especially the beginning of the story, they look Indian, but they dress like Americans. They talk like Americans. So they do have this connection to India, and in another way, they really don't have a connection. And they're coming to these sites to see the different cultural centers of India, but they're not fully appreciating it. And in many ways, they're kind of distracted and even disconnected from each other and from what's going on. We also have marital strife again, and some strife and disconnection or alienation between the parents and their children. We have Tina, who's one of the children. There's an argument about who's going to take Tina to go to the bathroom. Nobody wants to do that. And Mrs. Das is painting her nails, putting on fingernail polish, and Tina keeps saying, "Oh, do mine." And her mother's like, "You're annoying me. Stop bothering me." That kind of thing. Eventually, we do again, the theme I didn't list it here, but we do have the theme of secret telling and secrets between husband and wife. And Mrs. Das makes a confession to the interpreter and tells him about what has been actually going on in her marriage, and tells him some things that change his view of her and of the situation. So, it's interesting. I'm not telling you guys what that is, but the story doesn't have a distinct resolution in the ways that many stories have. We just kind of have this moment of connection between Mr. Kapasi and Mrs. Das, and these secrets are revealed, and then because of that, something happens, and then they're disconnected. So they kind of come together, and I don't think in a romantic way, though some people have read it that way, that he's maybe romantically interested in her. I think more they seem to have an understanding for a moment, and then they don't, and then they're disconnected from each other, and each person in this story really is kind of isolated. So, some themes and motifs, if you can't tell already. Motif is a repeating element, something that keeps happening over and over. So, like marital arguments might be a motif. Secrets might be a motif. The idea of a theme it's an abstract idea that the author kind of has a message or something to say. So, there's a quote from our first story, When Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine. And I kept thinking about that, that the narrator said, he made me feel like I was a stranger in my own home. Now, she's saying that in a very almost innocuous way, because he gives her some candy, and Lilia, as a 10-year-old, feels like, oh, it's like a little bit awkward. I feel like a stranger in my own home. But I think that idea of feeling like a stranger in your own home is almost in each one of these stories. That Mr. Pirzada, being from a country that's in the middle of a war and living temporarily in the United States without his family, he feels like a stranger in his own home. In a temporary matter, we have two people, and particularly, I think, the husband, who really wants a connection with his wife, but feels disconnected from her, and they're like two strangers sharing the same house. In the third story, we have people who have come back to their home country, but they really are strangers there, to the point that they need an interpreter because they don't themselves speak the language. Likely they grew up in America, and then their children did as well, right? So this idea of people who are kind of connected by race, by ethnicity, by cultures, by traditions, by customs, all of that. And yet at the same time, they're kind of divorced from that culture, from those customs, from those traditions. And they're living in a country where they don't learn about their country of origin. They don't have, even at one point, during Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine, the news stops reporting on that war because it isn't, connected to America in any way. So I want you to kind of think about that as the major theme connecting all three of these stories. And I also want you to look at what are some of the universal messages here that are meant really to say this is the human experience, no matter what country or culture or traditions you come from. These are things that are universal, of marital strife, of feeling disconnected in our modern world. And then what are things that are maybe specifically unique to the characters in the story, to the people of India, and that kind of thing. So those are some things I like you to think about through the next couple weeks, and I hope that you enjoy the stories. That's it. Thanks, everyone.